Hey there, it's Silver. This is Delusion. So this video was a little while in the making because I actually intended to cover this when it was in early access, but it was just so absolutely fascinating and interesting that I decided to wait until it was complete. And now that it's done, it's hit its 1.0 launch, it's time to actually take a look at it. So what the heck is Delusion? Well, it's a first-person RPG, but as you can probably tell immediately just by looking at it, it is heavily inspired by some classics of the past. This game gives me the same feeling as I got when I first played Morrowind, as well as that feeling of first exploring something else like Arx Fatalis. It is thematically quite similar to games like that. But it is an open-world RPG, so you do have the full breadth of this place to actually explore from the start, and a lot of this video is probably just going to be describing what this game is like, because I think that's the best way to do it without showing anything that's too crazy or spoilery. And you are a prisoner, actually, of this union, this order of Templars who don't work exactly like you would expect a Templar-like order, or an Inquisition, in fact, as it's called, to work. Usually in settings, an Inquisition is all about one true deity, a god that they worship, and are stamping out the worship of anything that's different from it. In this case, though, this world is a bit different, and this union is called the Apostatic Union because they are against all gods, and this is an Inquisition that stamps out all worship of all deities, and in fact they don't encourage the worship of any of them. This world takes place on a bunch of floating islands. There is a surface to this world, however, roughly like 400 to 500-ish years in the past of this world, about 400-ish I think, some pretty horrible stuff happened on the surface, and the survivors had to go to the sky in order to continue living, because it is now a completely blasted hellscape with some sort of horrifying undead curse stuff happening, so you really don't want to go to the surface, and instead everyone lives up here in the sky now. As a prisoner of this order, you are tasked with sort of being let loose to work for them, basically, like you're serving your sentence by doing jobs for them. However, the organization of things up here is a little bit messy, to say the least, and it doesn't help that the island chain that you're currently on is sort of like the Wild West of this world, at the very edge of the influence of this Apostatic Union. In the past of this world, these creatures called Wiccans, which is spelled with 2 Ks, not Cs, not those ones, a little bit different, they used to worship the gods, and I can't tell for sure, but I think maybe the Wiccans are actually a separate race to like baseline humanity, because every time you see one of them, they have sort of a bluish skin color. So I assume the idea isn't that anyone who worships one of these gods are just called Wiccans by default, but rather that they're sort of a separate race that lived in harmony with them. However, the gods of this world are like horrifying Lovecraftian entities from beyond the stars that have awful reality warping powers and often demanded a lot of sacrifice and did a whole lot of really twisted stuff to the denizens of this area, and the Wiccans were sort of like a go-between that created contracts between these gods and everyone else to allow them to live together and get some benefit from them, but often at a very high cost. And the people were tired of paying this cost and decided to create a union of like-minded individuals that did not want to live under the heel of these gods anymore and rebel against them. And turns out they can be killed. They can actually be destroyed completely or forced to flee, and that's exactly what the union did. So now the Union is researching a sort of Magitech-like state of melding technology and magic, but being very careful about the use of this magic and how they apply it and who can use it, being very selective in that regard, so as to not go back to the days of unbound gods everywhere. However, this war that happened that resulted in the death of most of the gods was very recent, to the point that several people who are currently still alive remember it. And this also means that there are some areas, especially in this more Wild West region, that still worship the gods, or that still secretly research them and things like that. Some of the gods are still alive. And the plot here is really interesting because you can help to solve a lot of these problems or just overall affect the state of the world, but that's not actually what you're here for. You're not a hero and you're not here to save the world. What you're actually here for is to find this particular person who is a sort of brigand pirate-like lady who has been causing the Union some serious problems and has some sort of delusions of grandeur of her own. You gotta track her down by recruiting a bunch of other characters, getting on their good side, and eventually figure out what she's up to and how to stop her, basically. Everything else, all of the other solutions that you may be coming across, are sort of only an aside to that. So if you want to be like a purely selfish character and not help any of the other factions, you don't actually have to. The basic gameplay loop is going to consist mostly of exploration and talking to other characters about where to go next and who to find. There is combat in this game, although it's easily the weakest part of the game's mechanics. It's not bad combat, it's just very simple combat. You have a simple swing and a heavy swing that's charged up. You also have various spells that you can find, many of which are utility spells, although some of them are offensive. And you do have a basic character building system that works a little bit differently. You don't have levels per se, instead you have a delusion gauge. And as you're exploring around, you'll find these sort of crystal skull things that give you a bunch of delusion when you pick them up. You can also get progress on this gauge by completing quests, either side quests or main quests. And once this gauge fills up, you get 1 delusion. You can spend that to enhance one of your primary stats. And these stats have different skills that are affected by them. So if you enhance your strength, then your melee combat skill will go up, but also your maximum health will increase. Whereas if you enhance the sort of dexterity-like stat, then your stamina will go up, but also your lockpicking skill will go up. Things like that. So you have basic stats that have derived skills that are related to them, and you can enhance these however you want to create sort of a build. They can only go up to, I think, 9 or 10 as a max, so you do have a case of being very good at everything by the end of the game, just because if you're exploring a lot, which the game heavily encourages, that's basically what it's about, then you'll be finding a lot of these skulls to give yourself more delusion and make yourself stronger. Even though the combat is very simplistic, the weapons are actually pretty cool. They have really fun models. I just like the way that they look. I like the way that everything in this game looks, to be honest. It looks fantastic. But the weapon models are really cool, and you can get various materials to upgrade the weapons that sort of evolve them along different routes. And eventually, come end game, you can actually have stuff like basically a gunblade, a sort of big greatsword cannon thing, or like a big darkness weapon and stuff like that. So you do have some options later on as to what to turn your weapons into for their sort of final upgrades that are actually quite interesting, even if the combat is quite simple. But the real meat of the game, as I mentioned, is the exploration and the side questing and stuff, because you do have that main thread that you're chasing all along the areas, but each area is going to have its own problems that you can optionally choose to face, and you'll get the most out of the game if you explore and face these various side quests. You may go through several different hoops and find that there's a god living underneath a big castle, and he's sort of there in secret. He has happened through various forms throughout his existence, and his current form is a lot more sort of fungal cave creature than anything else. He is quite disturbing looking, but if you want, you can actually worship him, or basically align to his faction. Or you could, say, go to the Inquisition and tell them where he is, and they will actually send a detachment of soldiers off to kill him, and if you go back to the cave where you found him, he's just gone, because they actually did find him and kill him. So you can affect the future of that region in a couple of different ways, depending on choices like this. One of my favorite areas, though, would be the Endless area. The Endless used to be a kingdom of successful humans up in the sky, but they went through a sort of botched immortality kind of spell that caused all of them to die and yet not die, so they are undead permanently and are just unable to fully die. In fact, it's stated that even if they're cut up into pieces and turned into paste, they're still conscious, so it definitely does seem to be quite a nasty curse. But I think this area does a really good job of explaining something that I really like about the game, which is the fact that it basically is amoral, almost. It doesn't have like a good or evil morality kind of system in it. There is no mechanic that represents these things, and there's also very few choices you make that seem to be uncomplicatedly good or evil. For instance, when you first arrive in the Endless area, you'll find that occasionally the whole place shakes, like earthquakes are happening. And it turns out the queen of the area is actually the original person who was sacrificed in order to do this spell that got botched and turned everyone undead. And the sort of betrayal and sorrow that she felt at the time of her sacrifice manifested as a ghost that's separate from her. So even though she's the queen of the area up in her own castle, this ghost is still around, trapped underneath the main city. And this ghost is trying to shake apart the island and destroy the entire kingdom so that the Endless can all finally die. basically trying to lift the curse by means of pure destruction and just kill everyone and be done with it. And this is complicated by the meat situation. So the Endless need to eat meat in order to basically stay like fully sapient. If they don't have meat, then they devolve into sort of mindless zombie-like undead that just feast uncontrollably until eventually they sort of turn back into their normal selves and are really horrified by what they've done while they were in this state of like horror hunger. And they've developed a way to grow meat in a vat. The idea being it's mindless meat, so it's okay if they eat it because they didn't get it from a living creature that they had to kill. So it's sort of ethically okay meat, basically. However, once you get up to these meat vats, the meat itself will communicate with you telepathically and tell you that it's actually alive and it's conscious and it knows what's happening. At some point during the past years of its existence, it has developed sort of a brain and is now actually a living thing rather than just mindless vats. And they don't know this because it can only communicate telepathically with living creatures. Since they're all dead, they can't hear it. So you might say that telling them this would be the good thing to do. However, there is a sort of a traditionalist breakaway faction among the nobility of the Endless that want to go back to the days of killing innocent people and eating them. And pointing out the imperfection of these meat vats will embolden that faction and give them some more purchase to try and get the Endless back to who they used to be, basically aggressive invaders that just sort of conquered places in order to consume the populace. So you then have to factor that decision into the decision of the ghost, and if you choose to allow her to shake apart the Endless Island and destroy the kingdom and end the curse finally, or you try to convince her that there are people here that do like to exist, that it's not an endless curse for everyone. There are some who actually do enjoy being undead and want to continue existing and don't want to be killed. So as you can see, in this scenario, there is not really a good or an evil choice. Neither of these choices seem all that great, honestly, but neither of them seem pure evil either. And it seems like what you're doing is more about like tradition versus pragmatism more than it is good versus evil. And as I mentioned, all of this, despite being really well written and interesting, is entirely optional because none of this is why you're there. You're there for a specific NPC that you need to talk to. You're not there to solve the Endless's problems, so if you want to ignore all of these things, you can and just move on. So I really appreciate the fact that even though they're optional, the choices you can make in this area basically make or break an entire kingdom and an entire, effectively, race of people. And all of the areas that you'll find yourself exploring have dilemmas like this. They have these really morally gray choices where you're not really sure if any of them are good or evil, and you're rather just kind of trying to feel out what people think of the gods, what people think of the Apostatic Union, what people think of their own factions in these areas and what they've been up to, and the cost of keeping things the way they are versus changing them and how much you want to change them. Because eventually you'll end up in various places like, say, an old university that is studying a god in secret, or a sort of clockwork kingdom that has an almost cyberpunk-esque way of doing things, although in terms of technology they're more like steampunk. And they have a sort of god in a machine that they made themselves, and they now have to like ceaselessly obey whether they like it or not, although it's kind of confusing exactly what it means whenever it gives a task, so no one is entirely sure whether or not they're obeying the letter of the law, but they still have to enforce it very strictly. And eventually, at the end game, you'll end up getting your own flying airship, as well as going to the surface of the planet, which I'm not going to show, but is really neat and also horrifying. And also, you'll end up exploring these mysterious Emberian vaults. The Emberians were an ancient race of people who may have been responsible for the way the world is right now, but also sort of were a bit like the Dwemer in terms of being extremely technologically advanced for their time, but also disastrously misguided. And you can explore their ruins, which end up being like full-on sci-fi in a setting that is otherwise a very off-kilter kind of dark fantasy. It's just a truly wonderful game to experience. This is one of those games that you can only experience for the first time once, but will stick with you for a long time. There are several moments in this game so far that I will remember for a while because they left an impact on me, and the decisions you have to make are really interesting, and the vistas that you'll see while making these decisions will sort of burn into your mind because of the really fascinating and beautiful way that this game looks. It makes a lot of the individual faction quest lines and story climaxes really extra memorable when you have these very pretty and fascinating ways that everything looks in order to sort of back them up. This is a game that I would say 100% you should play if you like first-person RPGs. This is primarily a game about the questing and exploration experience, so do not expect deep combat. Honestly, the combat is the most forgettable part of this game, which is otherwise very hard to forget. So everything else it does is so good that I don't mind the combat being kind of there and done. You know, it's very utilitarian, it does its job and that's it, which is fine if everything else surrounding it is this fascinating, and it is. So I really don't want to say or show any more than I already have, because a lot of the appeal of this game is when you open a door and come across something unexpected and sort of take it all in for the first time, and that moment will be sort of burned into your brain for a while. It's really good at giving you those moments, and I would like for people to experience those for themselves as much as possible. So yeah, highly recommended Dread Delusion. It is a fantastic sort of 15 to 20 hour experience that is absolutely worth its asking price of 20 bucks, and I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for it if you wish to check it out yourselves. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.